Hello, my name is Homer Simpson, and I'm looking for a big star on TBS.
There's Dan Castellaneta from The Tracy Ullman Show.
Hey, funny man!
For nearly 4 decades, his voice has been the warm, chaotic soundtrack of our childhood. But the secrets of how Springfield was built don't start in a Hollywood studio. They began as innocent childhood jokes, practical accidents, and a legendary encounter with a superstar hiding in the shadows. To understand the bombshell truths Dan is sharing today, we have to go back to the very beginning, to a quiet Chicago suburb where the magic actually took shape. Long before that infamous studio silence, Daniel Louis Castellaneta was born, October 29th, 1957, in Oak Park, Illinois, a Chicago suburb that gave the world almost nothing to suggest it would eventually produce the voice of the most famous cartoon father in television history. As a kid, he'd sit and listen to his father's comedy records for hours, doing impressions of the artists on them long before he understood that mimicry was actually a skill people could build a career around. One of his earliest character voices wasn't even his own idea. He borrowed it from one of his sisters, who, as a little girl, used to put on a scratchy, exaggerated old person voice and declare, half giggling, that she was a grandma. Dan and his siblings all used to do it, that same silly old man, old woman bit, and decades later, when Matt Groening needed a voice for a cantankerous, half-lucid grandfather named Abraham Simpson, Dan reached straight back into that childhood memory without a second thought. Grandpa Simpson, one of the most recognizable old man voices in American television, started as a joke between kids in a Chicago suburb, and neither of his sisters ever got a writing credit for it. He enrolled at Northern Illinois University, intending to become an art teacher, a plan that quietly dissolved once he discovered Chicago's Second City Theater Company, joining the legendary improv troupe in 1983 and staying with them until 1987. He's described Second City in interviews since as a place that, if you weren't funny walking in, would train the funny into you before you walked back out. A blunt, almost brutal kind of comedy boot camp that shaped nearly everything he'd do afterward. It was there, performing live sketch comedy night after night in front of unforgiving Chicago crowds, that Dan built the elastic, endlessly adaptable instrument his voice would eventually become, learning to construct a fully formed character out of nothing but a voice and a posture within seconds of walking on stage, since improv audiences don't wait around for a slow character introduction. It's a skill that maps almost perfectly onto voice acting, where a performer gets a page of dialogue and maybe a single line of description and has to invent an entire personality to fill the space around those words, though nobody in that Chicago audience, watching him build strangers out of thin air night after night, had any idea what they were actually watching take shape. His break came in 1987, when producers casting The Tracy Ullman Show needed voices for a strange, crudely drawn set of animated shorts about a dysfunctional cartoon family. And rather than hiring dedicated voice actors, they simply asked 2 of the live-action cast members, Dan and fellow performer Julie Kavner, to voice the father and mother instead. Dan's first attempt at Homer's voice was a loose impression of gruff character actor Walter Matthau, and it worked for about 10 minutes at a time. The problem was the job itself. Recording sessions regularly ran 9 or 10 hours, and Dan simply couldn't sustain a full-throated Matthau growl for that long without wrecking his voice entirely. So he did something that would define the rest of his career almost by accident. He dropped the voice down out of his throat and into something looser, lower, and far easier to hold for hours at a stretch. Once he had that foundation, the character kept evolving through the show's second and third seasons, because Homer's emotional register swings so wildly from scene to scene, wounded, gleeful, furious, and blissfully oblivious, sometimes within the same 10 seconds, that Dan needed a voice flexible enough to swing with him. He's described settling the sound low in his throat, specifically so he could snap between registers instantly. Panicked despair over losing money one moment, pure joy at the sight of donuts the next, without the transitions ever sounding forced. That practical compromise, made mostly to save his own vocal cords, became one of the most recognized voices on the planet. Homer wasn't the only character built on a foundation nobody in the audience ever saw. Krusty the Clown's rasping, cigarette-worn cadence traces directly back to Bob Bell, the Chicago television legend who played WGN's Bozo the Clown for over 2 decades while Dan was growing up in Oak Park, close enough to have absorbed that exact voice without ever consciously trying to. Groundskeeper Willie very nearly sounded completely different, originally conceived and performed with a Swedish accent that the writers ultimately felt read as too low energy for the character's manic intensity. Searching for an alternative, Dan flashed back to a bitter, foul-mouthed Scottish TV chef sketch that fellow performer Dave Thomas used to do back on the Canadian series SCTV, and Willie, in his current, growling, threatening form, was born almost on the spot. The character's most famous physical gag, tearing off his shirt to reveal a surprisingly ripped torso while digging Bart out of a well, was deliberately written to play against the pot-bellied image the voice itself suggested, a visual joke built entirely to subvert what audiences assumed Willie's body must look like based on how he sounded. Mayor Quimby's Kennedy-flavored mumble came from an entirely different corner of Dan's memory, an old comedy record by Vaughn Meader called The First Family, a Kennedy-era satirical album Dan had listened to as a kid. The impression stuck close enough to its source that it reportedly irritated people connected to Ted Kennedy's camp over the years, an unusually direct, real-world ripple from a joke originally built for a cartoon mayor of a town that doesn't exist. Barney Gumbel's voice emerged from a stranger, more layered memory, a children's record featuring Mr. Magoo and his nephew Waldo, voiced respectively by Jim Backus and Dawes Butler, blended in Dan's mind with a touch of Frank Fontaine's beloved, boozy, crazy Guggenheim character from the Jackie Gleason Show. Even Hans Moleman, one of the show's most reliably abused background characters, started as pure accident, a frail, half-blind old man squinting at an eye chart in a single DMV sketch that Matt Groening found so unexpectedly funny he kept bringing the character back and back and back, killing him off in one episode only to resurrect him again whenever the writers needed a quick, cheap laugh. Some characters arrived because Dan simply couldn't stop being funny at the table read. Gil Gunderson, the show's perpetually desperate, sweaty-palmed salesman, was built as a direct homage to Jack Lemmon's performance as Shelley Levine in Glengarry Glen Ross, an actor Dan has said he genuinely idolized growing up. Showrunner Mike Scully originally intended Gil as a one-episode throwaway character, nothing more. But Dan was so relentlessly funny performing him at that first table read that the writers started deliberately inventing excuses to bring Gil back, episode after episode, until a character who was never supposed to exist beyond a single scene became one of the show's most beloved recurring faces, built entirely on the strength of one actor refusing to let a bit die after its first laugh. The show's guest stars gave Dan some of his strangest, funniest offstage stories, moments that never made it anywhere near the actual broadcast. Johnny Carson recorded a guest voice during Dan's run on the show, an almost surreal collision of two very different eras of American comedy meeting inside the same tiny recording booth. When the Rolling Stones came in to record, Dan and his fellow cast members noticed what he's since described as a strict, unspoken rock and roll hierarchy playing out in real time through nothing but who showed up late and by how much. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards arriving roughly 45 minutes behind schedule, Elvis Costello 30, Tom Petty 25, Lenny Kravitz 23, with Brian Setzer notably right on time. Jagger, Dan has said, was quiet, immaculately dressed, and gone the instant his lines were finished. Almost nobody left in the room to register he'd even been there. Keith Richards arrived demanding his microphone, tumbler of vodka and orange juice already in hand, and proceeded to be, in Dan's own words, wildly, unexpectedly good on the mic, despite requiring what felt like subtitles just to follow along conversationally. Richards signed Dan's wife's old Rolling Stones album that day, scrawling beneath his signature, "Old Band, Old Party, 2002. And when she asked why he'd written that particular year, he told her simply that he never thought he'd actually live to see it. A similarly disorienting moment happened during a session with U2, when Dan was introduced to the band right before recording and, staying fully in character, greeted Bono with Homer's signature opening line, a cheerful "hello," Bono delivered in that unmistakable, half-asleep drawl. Bono's genuinely startled reaction, a stunned, very audible expletive, caught on tape before anyone could stop it, became one of those studio moments that never aired, but that Dan still brings up decades later as proof of exactly how strange it is to watch famous musicians realize in real time that the voice coming out of an ordinary-looking guy in a booth is the same voice that's been living rent-free in their kids' heads for years. But no guest voice story Dan tells carries the strange, layered weight of what happened during the third season premiere, an episode built around a mental patient who believes with total sincerity that he is Michael Jackson. Jackson was a genuine fan of the show, and rather than making the usual celebrity cameo request through layers of publicists, he simply called Matt Groening directly one night, out of nowhere, an offer so unexpected that Groening initially assumed it was a prank and hung up on him. Once the collaboration was confirmed, real Jackson set a single, non-negotiable condition. He would voice the character's speaking lines himself, but his name would never appear in the credits. Replaced instead with the pseudonym John J. Smith, and due to strict obligations tied to his record label, he would not be allowed to actually sing on the show at all. Rather than treat that restriction as a limitation, Jackson turned it into a private joke on his own family, quietly arranging for a professional sound-alike named Kip Lennon to perform every sung note in the episode, specifically so he could later needle his own brothers by letting them believe an impersonator had fooled the entire production. The read-through for that episode happened at the home of Jackson's own manager, and it's here that Dan's late arrival becomes the whole story. Jackson, by nature, intensely shy and uncomfortable with small talk among strangers, had deliberately timed his arrival to the read-through down to the minute, planning to walk in, sit down, and begin performing immediately without having to sit through casual mingling beforehand. Dan mixed up about the actual start time and killing time elsewhere in Hollywood beforehand, arrived a full 30 minutes late, walking into a silent, visibly uncomfortable room, everyone seated, nobody speaking, Michael Jackson included, all quietly waiting on the one actor who didn't yet know he'd disrupted a very carefully planned entrance. Dan cracked a joke about being on time for once being the polite version of showing up early. The read-through went forward, and whatever awkwardness lingered from that silence dissolved completely once the actual work began. What emerged from that session was, by nearly every account since, one of the strangest and most genuinely warm collaborations in the show's history. In the episode, Jackson's character helps a heartbroken Bart write a song to repair his relationship with Lisa after Bart forgets her birthday. And off-screen, Jackson did exactly the same thing for the show itself, personally writing and helping produce the original song used in that storyline, later expanding his contribution into Do the Bartman, a single that would go on to top charts across multiple European countries in 1991, an actual #1 hit quietly gifted to a cartoon by one of the most famous musicians alive, credited everywhere except under his own name. For years afterward, the show's own staff kept the secret carefully guarded, and even Matt Groening pressed directly on late-night television about whether the rumors were true, would only hint at the truth without ever fully confirming it, protecting a promise made at a silent table read years earlier. It would take until 2018, in an interview Groening gave to an Australian outlet, for him to finally say plainly what fans had suspected and half confirmed for decades, that the voice really was Michael Jackson's own. The episode's afterlife carries its own quiet sadness that Dan and the rest of the cast never anticipated back in 1991. Following renewed and serious allegations against Jackson, detailed in the 2019 documentary Leaving Neverland, the episode was quietly pulled from syndication, streaming, and reruns entirely, effectively erasing from official circulation one of the warmest, strangest collaborations the show ever produced. It leaves Dan and his former castmates holding a memory that genuinely happened, a silent room, a shy superstar's carefully timed entrance, a secretly gifted hit song that the wider world can now barely access to judge for themselves. A complicated kind of nostalgia that doesn't resolve as neatly as most Simpsons trivia usually does. Away from the guest stars and the character voices, Dan's own relationship to the show has stayed almost startlingly grounded. He's been married since 1987 to writer Deb LaCosta, with whom he's co-written several episodes of the show itself, and he's said plainly in interviews that he tries not to talk about The Simpsons at home at all, though he's admitted that if Deb happens to be making lunch, he occasionally can't help murmuring an unmistakably Homer-flavored sandwiches under his breath. Unlike the donut-obsessed, beer-guzzling character who made him famous, Dan is a lifelong vegetarian and teetotaler who practices Tai Chi regularly, a real-life contrast to Homer so complete that it borders on comedic irony all its own. Matt Groening has said publicly that he can't sit in on Dan's recording sessions anymore because watching him work in character makes Groening laugh hard enough to ruin the actual takes. And some of the show's most iconic moments were never scripted at all, including Homer's now famous chant of "I am so smart, S-M-R-T," a simple, unintentional slip of the tongue during a take that stuck permanently in the finished episode precisely because it sounded exactly like something the real Homer Simpson would actually get wrong. By 2001, the word Homer had helped make famous that single frustrated grunt. "Dope!" had been formally added to the Oxford English Dictionary, a linguistic legacy that started as a stylistic accident during the character's earliest days on The Tracy Ullman Show, when nobody working on the shorts could even agree on how the sound should be spelled on the page. Some writers pushing for an apostrophe, others convinced it should simply be written out phonetically. A small, silly internal debate that eventually settled officially on the credited spelling of annoyed grunt in the show's own scripts. Dan's own compensation grew alongside the show's cultural weight, from $30,000 an episode in the earliest years through a tense 1998 standoff where Fox genuinely explored replacing the entire main cast with new voice actors rather than meet the cast's salary demands, up through successive renegotiations that eventually brought his episode fee past $400,000, a steady, hard-won climb that mirrors, in its own way, the quiet, accidental path that first got him into that recording booth back in 1987, a Chicago improv actor who dropped his voice an octave to save his own throat and ended up building half the population of an entire fictional town in the process. Now that you know Grandpa Simpson came from a childhood joke between siblings, and that one of the show's most famous episodes came from a superstar shy enough to time his own entrance down to the minute, which of these hidden origin stories changes the way you'll watch these characters from now on? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. If this story brought back some real nostalgia, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe for more of the true stories behind the shows that raised us, and we'll see you in the next one.